those sturdy legs. He's pretty good at running in deep snow, and he has some pretty thick paws to help out with that. Here's a view of the skull. It is a kind of a peculiarly flat skull on the top, but you can see these big teeth. Actually, that's upside down. That's why it looks so weird. Looking at the underneath, you can see by the teeth that this is right side up. He's just done an unusual view of it. Here is the actual skull itself. You can see it has a huge flared zygomatic arch. That's what makes his head look very heavily built. There's the contour drawing of the skull. And some shading work done. You can begin to see the orbit of the eye better and see that the real shape of that zygomatic arch. It's a very big flared bone. Of course, we know how important the teeth is for identifying a mammal. And here's the beginning of the gouache and colored pencil technique. You can see the yellow ochre is the background color of gouache, and he has begun to do some pencil work, adding some white highlights and some kind of sepia colored highlights. Here's another view, top view of the skeleton, and you can really see how flared the zygomatic arch is. And that is involved with those big, heavy teeth and supporting the jaw with those teeth. Here's a side view. That's a strange one.
I think that's the jaw on the
It's the
top.
underside
I
of the
think
jaw.
that's upside down. Posterior of the skull, and you're looking also kind of up at the bottom of the see where the jaws, the V of the jaws there, and some interesting lighting on the teeth. I think he was just experimenting with trying to figure out which way he wanted to draw it. So here's your materials, the gouache, and the palette is similar to what we used last term. It's yellow ochre, white, sepia, and burnt umber. So here is the yellow ochre base coat, and he's beginning to paint in the teeth with just white. Here he's adding the full teeth in white. They're not modeled yet, but the background color for the teeth are in. He's beginning to show how that zygomatic arch flares with putting in the sepia shadows. Here a lot more color work, beginning to see some of the textures that are on this on the bone. Especially the lower jaw has a very textured kind of surface. And some modeling in the upper teeth. So again, this palette is yellow ochre, sepia, and a little bit, there's just a little touch around the eye socket area of the burnt umber. This one I think really was supposed to come before that. So it's this one, then this one. There we go. Wait a minute here. I'm going to. So again, here you can see how much more detail he's put into that lower jaw and really beginning to show the insertion of the teeth into the upper skull with a lot more dark sepia and burnt umber. So you're really beginning to get a sense of the hollow areas that are in this skull and the texture of that jaw. Here I think he was just comparing the drawing at that stage to the skeleton. Just to kind of compare the two. The top highlight of the jaw against that dark umber. So it's really beginning to be much more three-dimensional. Much more work rounding that skull, behind the eye, the orbit of the eye, because it's not flat, it's a rounded skull. So he's beginning to model that with the darker tones.
I have a quick question.
Mhm.
So, is this still in gouache, or did it switch to
The
pencil after
background,
the first?
okay, these darker colors are pencil.
Okay.
Yeah, the background color, the yellow ochre, is the gouache, and I think he used white gouache for the teeth.
Okay.
So you can do that. Now some people do lay, but for something like this, I really think direct drawing with the pencils, you get much better detail than laying. Let's say, well, maybe he didn't really know when he started that jaw would have so much, burnt sienna in it. But some people will spot coat with different colors of gouache. I don't think it's a great way to go with the skull. Maybe for a full animal, if you were going to do it in gouache and pencil, that would make sense. But I think with the skull, I would just use that nice palette of the yellow ochre base color. Because the pencil sticks well to it, as long as you don't get the gouache on there too thick. Again, and this is a really nice section where the teeth insert. You see the little highlight. Let me point it out. He's really beginning to get into more nuances now. Some of these beautiful striations on the top of the skull in white, really putting in a strong highlight or raised areas that catch the light, especially here, here. And if you notice this, this little pale line of white that shows the insertion of the teeth. The teeth have a little shadow right before you see that line, and that really helps you feel that those teeth are inserted into the jaw. And some of the little detail, striated areas of the bone here. So it's getting pretty detailed now. gone a little bit darker. And you can see those striations in the bone on the very back end of the top part of the skull are popping out. A little more color down along the elongated part of the lower jaw. A little more burnt umber in there. Here you see a big color difference and in detail. You can see the sinuses, those little holes on the bottom of the long part of the jaw. So he's really picking up more and more details now as we go. And you get that kind of a really nice rounded feeling of the skull behind the zygomatic arch with all the bird sienna and umber he's put in there. He's beginning to really round the Brayton case. Much more color. See a little more work in the teeth. And you can see how the bottom jaw now, with that strong highlight on the top and the dark umber behind it, is really lifting forward. It's beginning to get very, very dimensional. And the eye socket is looking very much like a negative space. So you're beginning to be able to read all these levels through his rendering, through all these details. And the highlights are, of course, you can tell that it's upper left hand lighting, the way it's striking all the little high points on the skull. So again, the lighting is extremely important. The color seems much more uniform throughout all areas of the skull. He's built that very slowly and carefully, but you still see quite a bit of the yellow ochre underlay. It's still the canvas for the pencils, for the pencil work. Just a little bit more, just adding a little bit more highlights in some areas, a little bit more darks. This one's probably the darkest image so far. And you can see the stronger white highlight now on the yellow ochre brain case. He's really working with the lighting analysis here. And the teeth now aren't as white. They are, they've been toned down with that very light burnt sienna that he's used in the teeth. And that's the wolverine.